Hello, my name's John. This is a painting video and you're watching Wargames, Models and Other Hobbies. Hello and welcome to the video. Today I'm going to be running through the basic methods I use to create metallic finishes, metal finishes. I mainly use metallic paints, but I also use washes and other colours and things like that to get the finishes that I look for. All of these methods that I'm going to run through are the very kind of basic level that I do. I often add extra layers of colour and things like that to them, but I always start with a base colour, which we've got in front. So I've got here the kind of the steel finishes that I'll run through: rust, weathered paint, coppers, brass and bronze, silver and gold. So what we'll do is we'll start with my most common paint finish that I do when I'm doing a metal, which is a kind of a steel or a silvery metal, and we'll work through them through the video. So let's move them out of the way. So the first one we're going to look at is just how I do a metal finish, a steel finish. So I've pre-painted all of these bases. So this one I've started with a base of lead belcher, and what I do after I've done the lead belcher is give it a wash of Nuln Oil. So let me get a brush to do that with. Oh, there we go, that's a nice big brush. So I've got my hairdryer with me as well, so I can speed dry these. So we'll try and do this as a real painting. We'll try and do this as a real-time painting video. So the benefit of doing it on this base is I don't have to worry about kind of going over the edges and things like that. So I can do it quite quickly. In reality, when I'm doing this on a model, I take a bit more time prepping the section and so on, because obviously I've got other colours and things like that. Metals tend to be one of the layers that I do throughout a model, so I might paint some metal before I do others and that kind of thing. It just varies and it depends on whereabouts on the model it is. So there is the first coat of Nuln Oil. What I will do now is a quick force dry on that. Making sure it doesn't run away. Let me pick this up actually while I do this. Now it's really important, if you're doing force drying when you've done washes, is to actually move it around quite a bit so you don't build up too much in one area if it blows it around. Okay, that'll do for now. So what I will do, let me zoom the camera in a little bit so we can see this a little bit closer. There we go. So there is the first layers on there. At this point, I then go into a bit of dry brushing to pick out some colour again. I tend to use the original base coat, so in this case I'm going to use some lead belcher again. But if you want a lighter metallic paint, you can go up to a light one, so you could use something like Iron Hand Steel, or even go lighter to something like Iron Breaker or something like that. But I'm going to stick with the lead belcher for now. And what I want to do with this is just a dry brush over the top of the whole thing. So what this will do, this will pick out the metal on any of the raised surfaces, so the wash will stay in all the kind of the gaps and the kind of the lower sections. But okay, nice and quick that one. So there we've got that layer on there. So what I tend to do now, I don't actually wait too long within the dry brush sections. I kind of will jump onto the next stage and so on. So sometimes I'll think about any additional colours that I want to add. So sometimes there might be some blues or something like that within the metal. So I tend to use a wash. So in this case, I'm using some Ashramend blue, but whatever wash you want for the colours, you might want heat treated metal. So you might have yellows, blues, purples, whatever. What I'm going to do with this is just a small amount of this. I'm not going to do it in all of the areas. I just want to put some blue in a few spots, and I'm not putting it so it kind of floods the whole thing with this colour. I do that later on some other finishes, but for this I just want it in a few places. Okay. So there we have that wash on there. Because it's a wash, I want to give it a little quick hit with the hairdryer. And at this stage I might build up some more wash layers, but what I want to do for this one is just put a lighter base on. So I'm going to use some Iron Hand Steel, and I'm going to do another dry brush over the top of this one. So let me just get a little bit of that on a brush. And what I'm looking to do, whoop, that's the hairdryer, is just bring that over to lighten that up. Let's get a little bit more on there. Okay. There we go. And finally, to finish up, I'm going to go back to the Nuln Oil, and I'm just going to pick out a few details with this. So with the detail of this, you could use some Agrax Earthshade or something like that if you want a different colour. But with this one, I just want to stick with this smaller palette. If at any point you put too much down, like that, you can just draw that out. Okay. Just want a little bit more on there. Just put a little bit onto that. There we go. So let's just touch that bit onto there. Just pick up that little bit of detail on there. Okay, so that is the basic kind of metal, steel, whatever that I tend to do. Next one I want to look at is the same thing, but when it becomes rusty and weathered. So I have another base here. Again, this is painted with Leadbelcher as a start, but rather than using the Nuln Oil, what I want to use now is some Agrax Earthshade to give a base. So I'm going to get quite a lot on my brush there. And this is going to give that basic level of colour that I'm looking for. Okay, as it's a wash layer, next step is to get the hairdryer onto it. So as there's quite a bit on there, I want to be careful. Okay, that'll do for now. So the next step is getting some rust build-up on there. So what I'm going to use to start with is some Rhinox hide. And this isn't going to be dry brushed on, it's going to be painted on in specific areas. So I'm going to get that paint. And I'm going to paint it on quite haphazardly. I'm not worried about keeping in any kind of like specific detailed areas or anything like that. But I'm just building up some of the kind of the lower layers of rust in there. So that is the Rhinox hide. Depending on how much detail you want to go through, you can jump through different layers of browns and things, but I'm going to go straight to a Mournfang brown. And what I'm going to do with that is dry brush over that Rhinox hide and on some of the other areas. Get some of that off my brush. That's so the aim here isn't to be too consistent with how you do it. I always recommend as well, if you're doing something like this, is have some reference material, so it gives you a good idea of what you're kind of trying to achieve. Okay. So that is that one done. So we've got that kind of rusted finish to the metal there. You can build that up and pick it up with other colours. So something that I often do when I finish one of these is use something like Rakarth Flesh and do a very, very faint dry brush over certain areas. And when I say very faint, I mean not much at all. Whether it's going to come out on the camera or not, I don't know, but we'll have a look. So it just knocks back some of the colour slightly. Okay, it does come up on the camera a little bit. Okay, there we go. So that is that metal which has started to rust on there. So if we compare it to my original one, that's the first one, and then that's that second one. The next step, if I've got very rusted metal, so what I tend to do is start with a brown base or an orangey base. So I've got some Mournfang brown for the base. What I then do, again, Agrax Earthshade, is to go over the whole of that with some Agrax. That up quickly while I just So this is for a metal that's really rusted through. So you might not see much metal on it at all, but you will get other kind of colours and things like that building up on it. So what I'm looking to do now, again, because it's a wash layer, is get the hairdryer. Okay, that's enough for that. Now, as I'm doing this as a real-time painting video, I'm using the hairdryer to knock this back to dry it really quickly. In reality, I tend not to use a hairdryer, so I do wait a lot longer for it to kind of dry and so on. But the next step on this one is to go for some Rhinox hide, exactly the same way as you did before, but this is going to be a dry brush rather than a painting in specific areas. Let's get that up there. So again, you can use as many different browns as you want and as many different colours, but this is just getting that basic brown onto there. What I then do is go back to the base colour. So in this case the Mournfang brown, and I'm going to do another dry brush with excuse me, the Mournfang over the top of this one. So this is just to pick out any of those small kind of details on there. And then finally, what I like to do with these, if you kind of imagine the situation that these are in, because they're bases for miniatures, the ground's going to be scraped, the ground's going to be rough and that kind of thing. So what I tend to do is a really light dry brush of Leadbelcher to show where the rust is knocked away from this metal to reveal kind of the shiny metal that once was underneath. It doesn't have to be Leadbelcher, it can be any metal that you want. You could go for one of the dark ones. I mean, you could go for something like, having a look what I've got here, you could go for something like the Castiliax bronze to get a kind of what looks like a tainted rusted metal anyway. But what I want to do with this is just a light dry brush. There we go. So that is now that one finished. So it is a rust finish with a slight metallic on top. Okay, so the next one I'm going to have a look at is when I have a chipped and worn paint surface over metal. So this again can be any colour that you want for the paint. I've started this one with a base of Mephiston red. What I need to do first is build up some dry brush layers of lighter colours with this before I go on to the wearing down of the kind of the paint, the metal and so on. What I will do is a little bit of a Muln oil to pick up a few of the details and then dry that, but I'm not going to put lots of it on. This is just to pick up some of the details here and there. So I'm going to put a bit too much on to begin with, and then I'm going to pull that back. And the key thing with this wash layer is don't worry if you go over any of the edges. What I am going to be doing, because I'll be doing the dry brushing, I'll be taking out any of this kind of overspill of the wash. But I don't need much, it's just to pick up some of the details of this material. While that dries, just going to quickly let the dog out. And as that hasn't quite dried yet, let's just get that hairdryer. Excuse me. So what I want to do now is some dry brush of a lighter red, so I'm going to go for Evil Sun Scarlet. Let's just get a dry brush for that and knock some of that paint off. So I'm just going to build that up like that. Next step, I'm going to use a much lighter colour, so I'm going to go for some Troll Slayer Orange. Might need a little bit more than I'd normally use on this one. Let's see how it goes. Let's just get a little bit more orange. There we go. Okay. So while that dries, I'm just going to close the back door as the dogs come back in. So now at this stage, where I've got a kind of a worn finish to the paint, I want to work through how the metal can kind of come out from the edges. So there's two methods. You've got chips, and you've got where it wears down. So I'm going to do both on this one. So what I want to think about first is the paint that went on there. Is there any primer on there? And if so, will some of that show through? So what I'm going to do is use some Corax White in this case to pick out some points where the primer might come through. And it's going to be twofold. So I'm going to do dry brushing as well as painting in specific places. The dry brushing tends to be where it's general wear. So let's say along this side is where people might walk a lot of the time. So I'm just going to gently put a bit of a dry brush over there like that. So this is where there's general kind of wear and tear, things being dragged maybe, and so on. Then got the other option of, let's say something gets dropped or knocked on it. What we're going to have is a specific edge that's chipped on there as well, and we'll have a little bit of a chip just on the top there, and we'll do something on the bottom just there as well. And at this point it's working out what metal you want underneath. In this case I think I'm going to stick with the lead belcher as it's my standard go-to for metal. So the first bit that we want to do is the dry brush. So over, just selecting a dry brush to use, Let's go for that one. That's right. Over the worn bits, that's where I want to do this first bit of metal. So wherever I previously dry brushed with what would have been that primer colour, I'm going to dry brush with that metallic that I'm using. And then wherever I painted for the chips, with that metallic, I just want to go over the edges of those, but not completely paint over the white itself. There we go. So there we have two of those kind of methods of worn and chipped. You can use a different colour for the base. Sometimes you could use a black or a darker colour, but I tend to like to go for a light base anyway, so that's what I go for. Okay, so the next one we've got is copper. So I've started here with a base of, let's get that in focus, Hashnut copper. I've got two different bases here. One's going to be heavily weathered, patinaed, the other isn't. So we'll do the standard one first. So as I've already given its base coat of the Hashnut copper, the next step is some Agrax Earthshade. I could use Nuln Oil. Let me just go sort the dog out. There we go. Where was I? Ah, yes. So, I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade, but you can... okay. So, I'm going to start off with some Agrax Earthshade, but you could use Nuln Oil. I might use a mixture of the two with this one. We'll see how it goes. But I'm going to start with the Agrax Earthshade. Let's just get a little bit more of that on my brush. I think I will use both actually, just so you can see the combination of the two. But whenever I'm doing metallics, I tend to build up a lot of wash layers, a lot of dry brush layers, just to get that depth. So although I'm only quickly doing it now, when I'm working on a miniature, I'll spend quite a long time kind of building up these layers. At the end, I'll get a selection of miniatures that I've done this on so you can see it actually in practice. Okay, so that's some Nuln Oil on as well. It's a wash layer, so I want to force this with the hairdryer, so I'm not going to take up too much time in this video. So the next step I always like to do with coppers and things is put a little bit of verdigris on it, and the best paint to do this that I've found is the, excuse the pronunciation, the Nyack oxide. I use this in small amounts on something like this, but in the patinaed one that we'll do in a little bit I use quite a bit. The important thing when you're doing it on a copper at this stage is you want to really select where you put it. So areas that would be hard to tidy up in reality and that kind of thing. So in some of the grooves and areas that kind of don't easily get tidied up and fixed if things are getting polished and that kind of thing. But tend not to use too much when I'm doing something like this. Let's just pick that up so you can see that. I'm going to have to force that because it does take a little bit to dry. And then finally with this one, I do a dry brush of the original colour or a lighter colour, depending on what kind of tone you're looking for at the end. Let's get some of that on the brush. And you might find you build up other layers of wash and that kind of thing when you're working on this one. But there we have that copper finish. Now I want to have a look at it if it's heavily verdigrised. So rather than doing a Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade, what I'm going to go straight in with is the oxide layer. And this is going to pretty much cover the whole thing. I'll start around areas of detail, and I want to use quite a bit when I do this. I tend not to brush it on over the whole thing. I let it flow where it's going to kind of sit and so on. So I just want to build it up. Run it down the sides. And then in those bits where I haven't painted, I'm just going to pull some of that paint into those middle sections, like that. I'm going to need to force dry this to get onto the next step. Like I've said before, normally I'll wait. Just move some of that paint. Whoop, that one flew. It's really important if you are force drying things is don't constantly blast it with the hairdryer or whatever you're using, because you don't want to soften the plastic or the resin too much to make it deform. So bit by bit. There we go. So my next step is going on with a wash or a shade in green. I'm going to use Thrakar green, but you can use any green that you have. And the key thing with this excuse me, is it's only going in a few places. So I'm not painting over the whole thing. It's just to pick up some detail on the object itself. So if you think about this as something gets a patina as it oxidizes, where does that appear? And you might find you put that onto areas where there wasn't any of that oxide paint. There we go. So at this point, depending on the colour that you're looking for, you might go for something slightly darker. So what I'm actually going to do is go for some of the Castellax bronze. Let's actually force dry that before I do any dry brushing. Quickly. So I'm going to use a smaller dry brush. So what I'm looking to do is build this up over areas that haven't got too much of the oxide paint on. I might stipple it a little bit, or just forcefully push it into those points. Okay. I'm going to get a little bit more of that to go over the whole thing. Let's look at the edges on that. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to call that one as done, so you can see that on there. The next one we're going to have a look at is brasses and bronze colours. So I've started this one with, get that in focus again, Rune Lord brass. This one is going to have less oxidation like as the last one had. So this one is just going to be the same way as I do my original colour, my original paint, by building up a wash layer and then doing other paints on top of this. So with this one, because of the natural colour of it, I'm going to use Agrax, but you could use some Nuln Oil as well. But what I'm going to make sure is that I get this in all the areas. So this is basically painting the whole thing with this wash layer. Quite a bit on there, that's okay. And if you want to do coloured metallics and you only have base colours like the coppers, silvers, bronzes, golds, whatever, let's say you want to do a green metallic, build up layers of washes over the top of a metallic. You might want to start with, say, a green coloured base, then go over it with a silver metallic, Then once you've done that, some washes in the colour that you're looking for, and some dry brushes of the metallic, and some more washes and that kind of thing. It's about playing around. Right, let's give that a forced dry. So these last few that I'm going to do tend to be a lot easier. So the first thing that I'm going to do is a dry brush of the original colour again. So go for that Rune Lord Brass in this case. Just a little bit on that. And then depending on whether you're wanting to go quite light or quite dark, you've got options. So in this case I'm going to go with Brass Scorpion, but if I was looking to get a darker bronze or something like that, you could go for some Castellax Bronze, or even some Rune Lord Brass again, but with Nuln Oil over the top. But we're just going to go for the Brass Scorpion for now. There we go. Okay. So there we have that kind of brass bronze. It's more of a bronze finish. Brass is a lot lighter. We've got that one. So the next one we're going to have a look at is a silver. So I tend to quite like quite bluey silvers. So it's going to follow the same process as we've just done, except starting with some granite steel as the base. I'm then going to use a blue wash in places. So in this case I'm using some Ashram Blue, but it's whatever shade or wash that you've got available in the colour. The key thing with this one is it's not going over the whole thing. Silver's a very light metal. So what I'll tend to do is where we've got any of the details, so in this case the crack on the base, and then I'll put it around some of these sections here. I'm not too worried about being too neat with this. Okay, there we go. And as always, it's a wash layer, so for these videos I need to force dry it. But before it's completely dry, what I will do is a bit of Nuln Oil over a few places. So I'll put a little bit in the crack on this base. I'll put a little bit around some of this star, some of these edges. Knock back this a little bit here, and on the top just there. So not a lot, just a little bit of Nuln Oil on there. And let's get that dried. And from this point it's back to dry brushing, and it's building up those colours. So I'm probably going to do 2 layers of dry brush. I'm going to start with the Storm Host Silver, and then because it's quite bright I'm going to use some Runefang Steel as a final dry brush. So let's get a bit of this silver. So not too much on there. What you might find as you work through these layers, you might need to put a bit more wash on in places. Which I will do actually. I'll put a little bit more on, so we're building up a few layers. I'm only going to do some of the blue. But it just lets you add some depth to what you're working on. And what you might find is you'll get a recipe that you really like, and you'll just keep working with that for a specific metal. I tend to follow, as you've seen from this video, similar rules for layers of washes, dry brushing and that kind of thing. But it all depends on that final colour, isn't it? It's what you're looking for. So let's quickly dry that. And then finally, I'll drop the hairdryer. There we go. I'm going to do some Rune Fang steel on this one, just to pick out some lighter colour on here. So I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. There we go. So there is our silver. And if you wanted it tinted a different colour, use a different coloured wash, different coloured shade. So the final one is gold. So sometimes I quite simply just paint it gold. So this is some Retributor armour. It's quite a dark gold, this one, but I'm going to build up some layers within this one to get a kind of more kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of a weathered finish. It's almost like a gold plate. Sometimes I kind of paint it all up so it looks like it's plated over metal, so you get slight wear, which we'll do on some of this. To start with, just with the way that this base is, because there's a big crack down the middle of it, I wouldn't normally, but I'm going to use some Nuln Oil in that area. Because it's such a different section to the rest of it, I just want to define it slightly differently on there. Let's give that a little bit of a forced dry before I go on to the next colour wash. Okay, I've put a bit too much paint in there, so let me pull some of that out. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the wash layer first. In this case I'm using some Graphone Sapphire, but any yellow, orange, light brown washes, that'll work fine. But this is going to be a full paint over, so this will help pick up any of the details on this base. And then finally, so I don't contaminate my pot, I'm just going to put some on my brush and finally run down the middle there where we've got that Nuln Oil as well. Oops. And now let's make sure this is thoroughly dry before I do the next stages. Okay, so the final stages is dry brushing. So I've got two colours here. I've got a Liberator Gold and then the Auric Armour Gold. I'm going to start with the darker one and I'm going to build it up lighter and lighter. So let's get a nice big dry brush for this one. And you might find with gold that you have to build up lots of different layers. You might find you have to do washes in between them. Okay, that's that first layer on there. Let's now do the Auric Armour. Let's give that one a real good shake actually. There we go. That's better. Right, so let's that up over there. There we go. Okay, nice and easy on that one. So let me just move some of these paints out of the way from the side. Now if at this point, shoving stuff out of the way, at this point, if you want it to look like plate, you can do a dry brush of silver over certain areas of the gold. So I'm not going to do it on this one actually because I want to keep this one just gold, but what it allows you to then do is create a kind of a look of it wearing and rubbing down over time. So let's get all of the bases in shot. Let's just zoom out so we can have a look at all of them. So we have 9 different metals here, so let's put the non kind of weathered ones at the top. So first one we did was this steel, my generic metal. We've then got the 2 weathered versions of that, so metal which is going rusty, or rust with metal shining through. Metal wearing through a painted surface. We've then got our coppers, so a standard copper and then more of a verdigris copper, brass or bronze, our silver, and then finally that gold. Now this is always a starting point whenever I'm painting these, so you'll often find that I'll build up other layers, different coats of paints, different weathering and things like that. But I hope you've enjoyed this video, found it quite interesting to kind of see these different methods that I use. I will at the end of the video put a slideshow up of various models where I've used these metallic finishes so you get an idea of it in actual use. But for now, thank you so much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. My name's John and you've been watching War Games, Models and Other Hobbies.